things in Jesus' name. Amen. I leave for Europe, for Italy and France, not next Monday, but the Monday after. So I only have, whatever that works out to, 7 presentations before I'm gone for a couple of weeks. But on this last trip, one of the things that clicked for me, I don't know if it's that important, about where we're at in Daniel 11 that's opening up, is that there's an argument now. I mean, I guess one of these ministries recently, within the last weeks, come out and said that anybody that's teaching that there's a message before midnight, that it's a satanic angel that is leading out in that conviction. It's amazing how many of these foolish arguments that they're bringing forth are arguments that were typified in the beginning of this work, okay? Because there early on, when we started teaching this message publicly in Adventism, one of the things we had to deal with, you got such a resistance over on several levels, was what was the Advent understanding of Daniel and Revelation, what we were supposed to have. Is there going to be any new light? Okay, so there was people that were fighting what we were saying by claiming, that there isn't going to be any new light. But when you go into the spirit of prophecy, very easy to show that there's going to be new light. So here we are again. It's the same argument. They don't get it, but to actually be claiming that there is no light on Daniel 11 until after midnight is a denial of inspiration, commanding us to search the books of Daniel and Revelation for new light, and identifying that there will ever be new light opening up to God's students of prophecy. If their argument were true, that there's not going to be any significant light on Daniel 11 until after midnight, then I would ask, okay, when was it that the Lord drew the line in the sand that's saying, okay, from this point on, there's no more light on Daniel 11 until we get to midnight? Okay, I mean, when did it start? And so basically, you'd have to go back with other of their arguments. It must have started before 9/11, because now another one of their ministries has come out in their newsletter identifying that 9/11, that nothing happened at 9/11. Okay, it was a semi introduction for us so we could see what was really the true fulfillment of it at midnight. So, but my point is that in this last trip, what the logic that connected to me is that this final message that comes before midnight, before probation close, which is the 7th seal for our history, it's going to possess the characteristics of the first seal. What was unsealed in 1989, what happened then, will be repeated in the 7th seal, because Jesus illustrates the end from the beginning. So when I began thinking about that in my mind, I realized that the Lord providentially preserved the truth that the first thing that He opened up in 1989 was the reform lines. Okay, and this is the first time we did the reform lines publicly. This is long time after 1989, but just so happened we remember the group that we were studying with at the time period that we started studying the reform lines, and one of the persons I met after 2000, hadn't seen him for a long time, and he and his wife had got married in our backyard in that time period. And I was still uncertain at that point exactly when we were doing that studying on the reform line. So I asked him when I seen him, when did you and Michelle get married? And he gave me the month and the day, of course, but it was 1989. So I know that we were studying the reform lines in 1989. And I hadn't known it till, I don't know how many years ago that was. It was well after 9/11. So some of these things that we look back in this reform movement, and we have evidence that this is a waymark because of this piece of evidence and this piece of evidence. Those of us that were there, we did not recognize that. We didn't know 1989 was the time of the end when we were studying that. It was all after the fact that most of these things awoke to our understanding. But what I came to understand is that it wasn't until 1991, roughly, if I could figure out a way to nail it down, I would, but I think it's right around 1991 that we went to these meetings where this preacher challenged me to go study Daniel 11:40 to 45 because I told him that what he had presented was incorrect, and I knew it was incorrect. And he said, well, why is it incorrect? I says, because when you go through those verses, you're doing this symbol literal, the next symbol spiritual, the next symbol literal. I said, it's got to be one or the other. It's got to be consistent. And he says, well, go home and study it. The point is that what I've realized here more clearly recently is that the essential elements of the light that was opened up at the time of the end of 1989 was twofold. It was the reform lines, and it was Daniel 11:40 to 45. So where, I don't know if this class here has reached a point to where you see the various lines in Daniel 1 through 39. Okay, that's what Tyler had up here in this lower hand left-hand corner. There's certain verses now that, like, what is it, verses, is it 5 through 9 or 6 through 9 that typify 538 to 1798. You have a line in those verses of Daniel 11. You have a line from verse 37 through 39 is a line. Verse 24 through 29 is a line. Okay, so the history that fulfilled those verses from the pioneer understanding, we're now understanding, was typifying histories here at the end of the world. But they're becoming challenging. Once you see the lines, once you understand the lines, then your next obstacle, I think, if you haven't thought it through, is that in some of the applications, particularly that the brethren from Africa have sent in, which I put in the public record before I left, so most of you were here to see it. In some places they're saying that Russia is the king of the south in this particular line in Daniel 11. But in another place they're saying Russia is Syria. And Syria is not the king of the south. Okay. In Daniel 11, Syria is counterposed. Is that a right word? It's in contrast with the king of the south. So you have to sort that through. If you haven't realized that's a problem, then you have to sort that through. But what clicked on for me is I realized that I believe that the applications that are being made, like I wasn't here for Tyler's presentations, obviously, but he told me about what he was understanding before we left on the trip. And yesterday when I was here for his summary, he was saying to us that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong because you studied it through with him, that in World War I, when they divided up Germany at the end of the war, that was typifying Russia? Is that right? Okay, so you got to grapple, if this is true, you got to grapple with the idea that in Daniel 11, at one point Syria can be it can be Russia, another point the king of the south can be Russia, and what's your justification for doing that? Okay, so what clicked on me on this trip, I'll get to my point, is that when the Lord opened up the reform lines, there was a logic that he was trying to teach his people. And initially we didn't see the logic, we were just following on in the study. And the logic was simply, and while I'm here, I'm going to try to nail this down more clearly, is that he brought us to a point to where we could see the same pattern in all of these sacred histories. We could see the same pattern in the time of Moses, the same pattern in the time of Noah, same pattern the time of Christ with John the Baptist, time of the Millerites. So he was showing us all these reform lines, and he was teaching us that you bring these together and they're illustrating the reform line at the end of the world. And we never knew any of that, any of where we were going in advance. We did not know. The Lord didn't say, okay, here's what I'm going to teach you. It's going to take us 15 years to get you to this point, but here's the ultimate goal. And step by step, 15 years later, you're at the ultimate goal. But he didn't tell us what the ultimate goal was at the outset. Okay, a good teacher will tell you what the ultimate goal is at the outset, but that didn't take place here. So as you look back at it, you can see that he was teaching certain things. And one of the things he was teaching, if you can get this is the point that I want to put in place, and then we'll move forward, is that as you're taking these reform lines, the reform line of Moses, the reform line of John the Baptist, of Elijah, whatever, you reach, and you know that they're illustrating the reform line of the 144,000, there comes a point to where it clicks on you, well, that every one of these histories is illustrating the history at the end of the world. Now, he didn't say that out front. I mean, Sister White does. She says that pretty directly, but until you begin to handle it through application, you don't realize what it means. You don't realize the implications. But once he gets you to the level that you realize that all these reform lines are illustrating the reform line of the 144,000, then you're at the level where at least two things can happen. You can see that, well, then this means that every story in the Bible is illustrating the history of the 144,000. It starts bringing that principle into focus, is that each of the prophets spoke more for our time than the days in which they lived, so that their prophesying is enforced. We could have read that right off the bat. We probably did in the spirit of prophecy, but it doesn't click until you have a structure and you're seeing, oh man, she really means what she says, that every prophet is speaking about the sequence of events that take place during the 144,000. And the Lord taught us that by bringing these reform lines together, and then you make the logical leap, well, they're all telling the same story. And that allows you to go broader and say every story in the Bible is illustrating the end of the world. But what that does, it brings you to a point, and I remember I consciously understood this, and I would purposely teach it hard. I would put this in place. It allows you to see what he did for us in 1989, 1991, is he gave us the reform lines, but in order to have the reform lines work, you have to have a template at the end of the world to line it up with. Okay, you got to have a point of reference to bring them all together. Okay, and that logic was developed as we studied this, and what we realized early on was that the point of reference was the history that's illustrated in the last 6 verses of Daniel 11. Okay, and what that means is that no matter what prophetic testimony in the Bible you're dealing with, your responsibility as a student of prophecy is to make that square at the end of the world with the last 6 verses of Daniel 11. Okay, so he gave us that job assignment. He led us to that understanding, the line of the tribe of Judah. And so here we are at the end of the world. And what I'm saying, at the end of the world, when he's opening up the 7th seal, the light on the first 39 verses of Daniel 11, he's doing the same thing. He's saying, okay, if you've got the aptitude to see, these first 39 verses of Daniel 11 are several lines of prophecy that it's your responsibility as a student of prophecy to come to correctly identify. But the point of reference where you bring them all together is, once again, the last 6 verses of Daniel 11. And the struggle that we should have, that I think that we should have now when we're dealing with the Third World War and Russia's involvement in Islam, is there any justification for saying in this passage it's Russia that represents Syria that's causing the crisis that forces the Seventh-day Adventists in the United States to lead out in some kind of connection with the government of the United States to persecute the faithful? Okay, we're deriving that from the League of the Jews in verse 23 of Daniel 11, and the Jews reached out to Rome to form this alliance, and we're saying that was midnight because of a threat from Syria. So we're saying that threat from Syria represents a threat from Russia at the end of the world, but we've already shown that Russia at the end of the world is the king of the south when it's in relation to the United States, the King of the North. So we have, at the surface level, there are some contradictions that have to be resolved. But the way you resolve them is whatever line is given, you bring it to the last 6 verses of Daniel 11, and you let the characteristics of that line define who the player is, and you have the same justification that he gave us at the beginning. You have a point of reference. It's the last 6 verses of Daniel 11. So in this line, that antagonist is Syria, and the last 6 verses of Daniel 11 tell us that that's a role of Russia. Even though in another line from the same chapter, we're identifying Russia as the king of the south. So you may not have grappled with that, those of you in this class yet personally, that you're actually at that dilemma. But I guarantee there's already people that are using that against our application. But anyway, it still sounds. So what I did, I was thinking, I wanted to come and go back to the beginnings and look at some of the things, because whether you realize it or not, these guys now that were here for a while, and the guy that was here for a long time, that have their own ministries that are teaching this foolishness now, they've thrown out everything. They may not understand it, but they've thrown out everything. The logic of what they're saying is that every claim that has been made about 1989 onward is false. Okay, because now, so this here, let me explain this. The Time of the End magazine, this is an original Time of the End magazine, by the way. And see, this here, if you've ever heard the explanation, is that this was put together from a series of 12 articles that were once a month in the Firm Foundation magazine over a year. And it was for Lord's Providence. It started on January, ended in December. So at the end of that year, we took those 12 articles and turned them into this magazine. But when they put those original articles in the Firm Foundation magazine, at the beginning, there's more than one article in the magazine. For this particular article, they would do some artwork. And this is the various artwork that were connected with the opening chapter, with a chapter over the year. Am I explaining that where you follow me? So the guy that put this together, he took the 12 articles and he formatted them into this magazine, but he also took the artwork from each of the chapters and he did a collage. And it wasn't purposeful, but the Time of the End ended up here. Okay, so that's why it was called the Time of the End. And we didn't understand the significance of the Time of the End when this was being published. That we weren't making a big deal about 1989 being the time of the end or anything like that, but the Lord held his hand over it. But you can see some other ones. One of the titles of one of the articles was The Great Escape, Nothing New Under the Sun, so None to Help. So all this was a collage, and it just happened that this one was on top. But anyway, this has been republished several times, and then there came a point where we went in and we actually did some changing of a few thoughts. We republished this several times without changing anything. And I think this one was republished without changing anything, but what we did do on this one that was a little bit newer than the original one is we added some current events, like here was a clip from a newspaper, Conservatives Help Unite Catholics and Southern Baptists, that was happening in that history. We got a picture of Ralph Reed, that was a prominent Protestant politician in that time period. Those weren't in the original. Some of the Episcopal Church, now Catholic, those were added in after the fact. But that's not my point. If you remove that, if you remove these articles from the newspapers out of this magazine, then you have the exact text of the first Time of the End magazine. And what blew my mind yesterday, because I had some suspicions about this, what you need to understand if you're going to get the gist of this is, I spent a year writing this stuff in a ministry, and the ministry didn't want to publish it. And it was every month when it was time to print the next article in a series of 12 articles, that ministry would fight. We'd have an editorial committee, and usually every article that went in their magazine, they had an editorial committee, and you'd come in and you'd say, well, this grammar and this is wrong, and you deal with that. That was the copy editors mainly. But then you'd have an argument, well, is the theology correct or not correct? And then you might have an argument, well, is it even worth dealing with? Is this important? But to do an article would usually take about 15 minutes to 45 minutes max for an article. But the 12 articles that went into that magazine over that year, we would have editorial committees that would sometimes go a couple days. And it would be pretty much me battling with all these other editors, saying, yeah, I get your point, but that's not what the Bible says. Okay, here's what the Bible says. Here's what the Spirit of Prophecy says. And they failed every time. And what was going on there is this was the leadership of a ministry that was trying to guard its own turf. It was a political thing as much as anything else. But the whole staff was behind it. So while these arguments were going on in the editorial committee, the staff was back in their sphere at the ministry in their rooms praying this thing through. And I mean, some of the battles there that went on, it was a real struggle to get it all the way to the final article in the last year, and then we put them together. And so when I had some thoughts about these two original studies that we're going to deal with. But then yesterday I was looking at this, and this morning Kathy got in. She took Clayton to the airport this morning at 3 o'clock. So she got in, she tried to go back to bed. 2 o'clock, whatever. I didn't notice because I was sleeping. And I asked her, do we have any originals? And she says she thinks so. And so we went out and we found one. And here's the point. Okay, in this magazine, and I checked it in this and I thought, well, this because this was printed in 2002 and this had some editorial addition. You know, I went in and I said some things differently in 2002. But this is the original, and this is the first chapter, the testimony of two rivers, where I'm setting up the context of Daniel 11. And the first inspired quote in the article, okay, is a quote, and I was telling Kathy on the way over here, this quote is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 paragraphs. And I used to use these 6 paragraphs to start every presentation I would do on Daniel 11, 40 to 45. And now you can do a sermon on these 6 paragraphs. And I did. These 6 paragraphs, way back when, I pretty much had memorized word for word because I did it so much, not because I have any special talent. The first paragraph has a statement in it where it says the Spirit of God is gradually but surely being withdrawn from the earth. So I would take that and show that, and maybe you don't understand this, maybe you haven't settled into this, but if you take the time, you can show the fact that she says the Spirit of God is being withdrawn from the earth is an evidence of the judgment of the living. Okay, because when you reach a point where the Spirit of God is being withdrawn from certain people, it's meaning that they're alive, and that they forever close their probation on the wrong side of the issue, which means that you're in the time period where Christ is making that choice between those that are going to be sealed for eternity and lost for eternity. So we used to put that emphasis on it, and even though we didn't understand the judgment of the living the way we do now, what I'm saying is very first paragraph, the judgment of the living was an issue from the very beginning. Okay, and the next paragraph says, the agencies of evil are combining their forces and consolidating. And I would go in and I would show what the agencies of evil are. Okay, you got apostate Protestantism, you got Catholicism, you got the United Nations. And from there, in this paragraph, when I was dealing with it, I would show the ecumenical movement. I could bring in evidence that those agencies of evil were consolidating. I could go in, particularly after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and show that the NATO, the military structure of the world were consolidating their forces after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I'd do stuff with that. And in the end of that very paragraph, it says, and the final movements would be rapid ones. This is that quote that you have this statement that most of us know, the final movements will be rapid ones. It's from this second paragraph. And I would really emphasize that, because when you get to the fifth paragraph, it says, the world is stirred with the spirit of war. The prophecy of the 11th chapter of Daniel has nearly reached its complete fulfillment. So I would want to emphasize for my audience that, look at, when Sister White here is referencing the last 6 verses of Daniel 11, and a few paragraphs before is where she says the final movements will be rapid ones. So when you come to the understanding of Daniel 11, 40 to 45, you should know as a student of prophecy that when those verses begin to be fulfilled, that it's going to be a very rapid sequence of events. That was what I was doing. Okay, but here's my point to all this. The very first quote in the Time of the End magazine that was put into the public in 1995 in 12 articles and then formalized into this magazine in 1996 was taken from Testimonies 9/11. Okay, that's 5 years before 9/11. And these guys are not understanding how rock solid 9/11 is when they're starting to say, that's why I'm saying they're throwing everything away. The Lord, if you're not getting it, the Lord made sure that He tied 9/11 in to Daniel 11, 40 to 45, 5 years before 9/11. If you've settled into the idea that it isn't a coincidence that Testimonies Volume 9, page 11, is where all this opens up about Daniel 11. And that it would, the history of the 144,000. It's the very first quote in this magazine. And I guarantee, even though I would take those 6 verses from Testimonies Volume 9, page 11 through 16, or what it was, that I'd do a sermon on it to start every presentation on Daniel 11, 40 to 45, I had no idea about 9/11, okay? There's no way. And nor did we have any idea about the significance of the time of the end. So what I'm saying, the reason that I'm going there is to make a point not only about what the characteristics of the 7th seal will be in our history, but of the darkness that these guys are going into when they're making these claims about 9/11 and so on and so forth. So this is the first study that we started in 1989. And if you're familiar with how I develop notes, you'll see that there's things in here I don't do anymore. But I have to use yours because the notes you have are just a little bit different than this. So do you still have one more set of notes?
Yeah, we have 2 sets here.
They're essentially the same. Okay, so this isn't something that was reworked. But in this, after 2 Peter 3:2, which is the first one, and the reason I had them numbered was because I was using this, it was my first attempt at a study guide, and then I knew that some of the quotes that I would use more than once, so halfway through I could say you could go back to quote number 2. That's why I had them numbered at that time. I, of course, don't do that anymore. The other thing I don't do, because I didn't know back then, you're not supposed to put quotation marks on Bible references. So I don't do that any longer. So this is old stuff, but the very first quote from the Spirit of Prophecy is, whatever may be man's intellectual advancement, let him not for a moment think that there is no need of thorough and continued searching of the Scriptures for greater light, as a people were called individually to be students of prophecy. And what I'm saying is that, yeah, I know I had a part to play in laying this out, but when I look back at some of the things that taken place, it wasn't me that was laying it out. because, I mean, we laid this out, these study notes. The very first quote from the Spirit of Prophecy is that quote, and on the back page, it's the same quote. You know, first and last, beginning and ending, and this is what it's all about in terms of understanding this, is everyone in this room or everyone that's watching this is called to be a student of prophecy, no matter what your intellectual abilities are. Okay, so that's where we started. And the reason that I'm struck by this is that if you go back through and you look at the very beginnings, you'll see how firmly the things that we're understanding about midnight and the midnight cry are put in place. We didn't know anything about midnight and midnight cry. I mean, we knew some stuff about the midnight cry, but even in this, I glanced through this again. Oh, by the way, one thing I wanted to say about this. Once this was printed, I started down this road. I was involved when we republished it, but we were republishing it simply because we ran out of them. People were buying them. If we went out to meetings, we'd hand them out for that meeting. So we had to reprint them. But after this was printed, I struggled with this for a year, writing these articles. And we put this together. I never went back and read this. It just wasn't anything I was inclined to go read. Other people did, but you know, I'd put my time in on this. And I was going through it last night, this one, the more modern one. I found some things in it that are wrong. Okay. Well, I know what they're wrong. I know when I grew in my understanding of these things, and it was in that time period where I was, for instance, in here, there's some confused ideas about the three horns being removed and the daily being taken away. Okay, because when I first started taking a position on the daily, I used Uriah Smith, and Uriah Smith will teach you that King Arthur was the last king to, or the first king, I forget what he taught now, but it was with King Arthur being, he marks 508 with King Arthur, and that this was the last pagan resistance. Well, I don't touch King Arthur anymore, because once people started challenging me on King Arthur, I realized that Uriah Smith he was reaching on that one, okay? Because you can't even support that there even was a King Arthur, okay? I think there was. I'm not denying that. But what I'm saying is the historical evidence about King Arthur is so all over the place, and it's in so many different centuries. People that claim that this is King Arthur and here he is in the 8th century or in the 5th century or the 6th century, that it's not really a history that you want to use, okay, in biblical application. But it wasn't even the legitimate argument about the daily being removed. So I know that in here, what I was reading last night, there's a place where I said that from 508 to 538, the three horns are removed. Well, that's not true. Okay, but that's what I used to understand, and that's what I used to teach, and that has never been cleaned up out of here. So there's probably a couple other things in here that are that way. But when I seen the first thing that was in here was Testimonies 9:11, I realized, wow, the Lord was overruling in how this came together. Okay, so when she's talking about the last crisis that we're going to put at 9:11, before she even puts the chapter title, she's referring to Hebrews 11, which is Paul's paraphrasing what? Habakkuk 2. Okay, so she's tying in the old past right there in the last crisis in Testimonies 9:11. And it's an awkward. Usually a chapter begins with a chapter title. But that first chapter in Testimonies 9 does not begin with the chapter title. It begins with Paul's paraphrase of Habakkuk 2. The reason I'm going through here, that I want to go through here, is pretty standard understanding. Used to be, maybe not anymore, time of the end. For the Millerites is 1798. By 1831 to 30, 34, you could put 33 in there too. In that history, the message is formalized. And then 1840, there's an angel that comes down. And in 1842, you have the chart put together. Okay. Now my point is this. Spirit of prophecy, real easy to show the spirit of prophecy identifies that the truths on this chart are the foundational truths. Not only that, she has a classic quote that we use where she quotes from Jeremiah 6:16, "Standing in the way and ask for the old path. Where's the good way? And walk therein, and you shall find rest for your souls." But they said, "We will not walk therein." Okay, so she quotes Jeremiah 6:16 and then ties it in with the truths on these charts. So we know the truths on these charts are not only the foundational truths, but they're the old paths. Okay, once you have that together, then you know the foundation gets put in place in this history here, and it does so in all these reform lines, whereas now, this is why they're having to deny. This is one of the logics why they're having to deny 9/11, because at 9/11 the angel of Revelation 18 descends, and they're wanting him over here at midnight to descend, because their main point of reference when they started all their foolishness was that at midnight, this is the effect of every vision. So they moved the foundation over to here, okay? And not understanding what they were doing, because the men that do this according to the spirit of prophecy cannot reason from cause to effect. And because they didn't realize what they were doing to this whole structure here by moving the effect of every vision here, you're moving the foundation here, then ultimately you're going to have to move this angel of Revelation 18 to here. That's what they're doing now. And they're saying whatever happened here was meaningless. It was just a practice for us so we could see this happening. But my point is these truths, they're developed over here. Okay, you could probably go back here to 1818 when
1860 to 7 years later, because that's what he says. 2 years he did a perusal study of the Bible, and in 5 more years he actually did it with detailed study of certain subjects. So you have 7 years altogether for William Miller.
Okay, so from 16 to 23 you want to say? But typically we'll say 1816 to 1818.
That was a perusal study of the Bible.
But so we'll do the 7 years to 23. Not. The point is, here he's gathered together the basic truths that are going to end up here. By 1831, he has them so developed that he has confidence, and he sends them off to be published for the first time. Okay, and if you're not aware of this, I think this group here is probably aware of it, but I shared this either in Eatonville here or Rescue over the past few weeks, and the people there weren't aware of it. But when Dwayne Dewey began searching out where Miller first published any work, he discovered that it was published in 1831 at a newspaper on the East Coast. And then he tracked it down and realized that somewhere after that time period, the Mormon Church had bought that newspaper. So he tracked it down and found that the original newspaper from that newspaper company was in Salt Lake City in their archives. So he reached out to the Mormon Church, and they gave him photocopies of the very publication that this newspaper did back then. But more than that, this is the part I like. They says, by the way, you know, we not only have the original newspaper that have William Miller's first public presentation, but we also have his handwritten notes that he sent in to us that we typed into our newsletter. And Dwayne says, well, can I have a copy of that? So we have a copy of his the handwritten first publication in 1831. Okay, so my point is that I'm not willing to turn away from 9/11 like these other guys are. Okay, so 9/11 is going to possess the same characteristics for our history that 1840 possessed for the Millerites. And what ultimately becomes the foundation for the Millerites, it's been developed over here. So when we're looking at this, and this, the Time of the End magazine, you're looking at the foundations. But prophetically, what's established in this history is going to be the foundation all the way through. You're going to see that right from the start, I mean, how many books did Ellen White publish? I mean, she didn't publish it. How many Ellen White books are there? How many pages? Okay, so my point is that the passages that are here are passages that are, they're the foundation for whatever reason. It wasn't human. They were there for a purpose because they stand right here just as well. That's what one of the things we're trying to show here. Okay, so
Brother Jeff, it's very interesting that the Library of the Pioneer Loma Linda in 1991, the same time that you guys were doing this, when you begin your study, right, 1991, went to the meeting and you were challenged of Daniel 11, 40, 45, that they began producing those 46 pamphlets about the Millerite history, beginning all the way from William Miller all the way down to 1888. And he took a period of 10, almost 10 and a half to 11 years. So you can see how the Lord had opened up another door for them to go back to the old path of Adventism. Yeah. At the same time that you guys were beginning to study or challenge of Daniel 40 to 45.
and yeah, the providential things that were happening, 1989, the internet comes into history. That's a time of the end. Look, I see on the news this morning that this cyber attack that they had worldwide over this weekend, they're thinking it was North Korea that did it. Okay, so this is what we've been saying. Perhaps a cyber attack, and you can see all the players. But 1989, this is where the internet comes in. Stuff like that that you don't see when it's happening. Down the road, it starts clicking.
Divine guidance.
Yeah, His providence. Okay, so number 3, ministers should present the sure word of prophecy as the foundation of the faith for Seventh-day Adventists. From the very, very start, based upon the quote that was before that, we were standing. I mean, you don't. When you get to a place like Hope International, where I got to, first time I was doing any kind of service for the Lord publicly, it's Hope International. And 3 years later, they fire me for all kinds of reasons, probably. But their stated reason for firing me is because they were under conviction that the Lord had called them into existence as a ministry to identify the sins in the Adventist church, and He hadn't called them to do prophecy. Okay, so they were purposely stepping away from prophecy. So my point is the time that I was there, the 3 years that I was there, I'm putting an emphasis on the fact that prophecy is the foundation of our faith and that we're all called to be students of prophecy, but I'm bumping heads with these well-known self-supporting ministers that were basically theologians, just like the theologians in Adventism. The Ron Spears, the Colin Standishes, the Ralph Larsons, the John Grosball. This is a picture of John Grosball, okay, from way back when. The fourth one, just the last phrase, every principle in the Word of God has its place, every fact has its bearing. If you don't, the application of this truth, maybe it's been applied in an unbalanced fashion. Okay, I don't think so, but a lot of people would say so. Lots of people would say so. A lot of people would say that it's a little bit fanatical to make the claim that Testimonies Volume 9, page 11 corresponds to 9/11, or that the character of Islam is found in Revelation 9:11, or that Daniel is praying about bringing to a conclusion the 2,520-year curse in Daniel 9:11. Okay, but because this movement got honed in right from the beginning on the idea that every principle in the Word of God has its place and every fact it's bearing, then we were open to the idea that every fact has some kind of, that God's in control of everything. Okay, so and next quote was, the Holy Spirit has so shaped matters both in the giving of the prophecy and the events portrayed. This takes this movement and puts it in a different place, whether you understand it or not. What this is saying here is that, yes, you'll have a prediction in God's Word. Here's a prophecy. Unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. There's a prediction, 2,300 years. But here it says, you also need to consider what's going on with the prophet when he receives this light on the 2,300 days. Okay, so this takes our prophetic application to another step. We're not just looking at prophecies. We're watching what the prophets are doing. What message are the prophets conveying themselves over and above the prophecy that they're laying out? For Kathy and I, the guy that we started studying the Bible with, he was sharper than we realized. I mean, he was in his 80s when we met him, and a couple of years after we met him, he moved away, and we went and visited him one time briefly after that, and then they were laid to rest long before we got into any kind of public service, long before, okay?
But he did let us know that he believed that was the only reason why he was brought up to Ridgecrest, was to bring us into the church.
Yeah, after the fact, where we were, people in California aren't even familiar with this town we lived in. It's kind of an obscure town out in the desert. And most people that travel the road close to where we live, they're going up to the ski slopes on the eastern side of the High Sierras, and they just pass by, they see a sign, China Lake Naval Weapons Center, but you have to turn off the main road and go down like 10 or 12 miles into the desert, and nobody ever does it. That's where we were at. So even people in California didn't know much about that town. But there was an Adventist doctor there that did chelation treatment, that, puts you on the IV, and then it put chelation in you, and it sucks out the plaque in your arteries and veins or whatever. So at their age, they came to try that, these people, and then they realized after they were there, they weren't there for the chelation treatment. They were there because Kathy and I are going to move in next door to them, and they're going to come out and say, are you Christians? And, okay, yeah, we're Christians. You want to study the Bible? So we start studying the Bible with them. And one of the things that he taught, he went through the book of Daniel and then the book of Revelation over a period of time. One of the things that he really emphasized is that in the book of Daniel, you have two themes going on. You have the prophecies in the book of Daniel that tell you what is going to happen at the end of the world. And then you have the story of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that tell you how you're supposed to live at the end of the world. So he was seeing this very principle here, that the Holy Spirit's not only shaped the prophecies that are given, but he controls the events that are surrounding the giving of the prophecy. So we were cued in on that right from the very start, our introduction into Adventism. And whether you realize it or not, this movement relies, we're seeing the prophets illustrate the Mara experience. How many other Seventh-day Adventists are considering that? Okay, this is where this starts, is right here in these passages. And then on number 6, you got what we used for years, the definition of prophecy. Historical events showing the direct fulfillment of prophecy were set before the people, and prophecy was seen to be a figurative delineation of events leading down to the close of this earth's history. And then we would define the word figurative and delineation. Right from the start, we're not understanding. I mean, in these notes, we're going to quote from Isaiah 28, but we're not understanding that Isaiah 28's line upon line is the methodology that the latter-rain message is conveyed to God's people. We're just seeing the lines at this point, okay? So we go into this word delineate, which means to sketch a form, figure, outline, sketch a design by lines. Figurative, representing by resemblance. So this is the next quote. We must have a knowledge of the scriptures that we may trace down the lines of prophecy and understand the specifications given by the prophets. These are the passages that the Lord is using to put together the prophetic line study, well in advance of us understanding the implication really of line upon line. Okay. The eighth one there, still used by people in this message on a regular basis. The Lord does not repeat things that are of no great consequence. If you see something repeated over and over again in the scriptures, then that's an emphasis that the Lord's putting on it. Okay, the repetition of history, the next quote is emphasized. And then by the bottom of page 2, each of the ancient prophets spoke less for their own time than for ours, so that their prophesying is enforced for us. And what I'm saying is, I don't yet know fully what that means, but way back when, this here, I'll tell you this story too, and you probably know this story, but I'll put it in the record. The people that knew Ron Spear, most of them really liked him. He was a nice guy across the board. He was a really nice guy. But he was, there's a word, and I want to get the right word. What was it?
Impulsive.
Impulsive. There's the word. Okay. Okay. He would do things that when he'd be out traveling, and he'd come back and say, I did this, and then his staff there would have to figure, well, how do we straighten this out, or how do we fix this, and so on and so forth. But when I was up there was a time where he had been in San Diego, and this is up by Tacoma, Washington. And he hired a guy while he was in San Diego, a guy that had just been baptized into Adventism in a church in San Diego. Okay, California church is pretty liberal. But the reason he hired him is the guy was a printer, and they were looking for a printer up there to get their printing operation going, where they could do it on campus and not send it out. And so this guy gets up there, and I'm talking to this guy, and I don't remember at all the conversation, but I remember where the conversation got to. Somehow, some way, I brought up Ellen White, and he says, "Who's Ellen White?" I said, "You were just baptized into the Adventist church, and you don't know who Ellen White is?" No, who's Ellen White? I says, "You just took a job at Hope International, which at that point is the cutting edge of self-supported ministry. They're in a full-blown battle with the General Conference. The General Conference is printing a book. I forget what the name of the book, but it was a real big book against self-supporting ministry at that time. That's so here, I'm looking at this guy, I'm saying, you're coming in to this warfare, you're right at right where the battle's taking place, and you don't even know who Ellen White is? And this is what the warfare is about, more with Hope International more than anything else, is the application of the spirit of prophecy. So it says, okay, what we need to do is we need to do a study with you so you can see who Ellen White is. And you don't have it in these notes, but these notes here that we printed today, the file that I have on my computer, it has the complete study that I used to do with this. And this study had 2 more studies after it, okay? And the next study that would be a continuation of this study was a study called Time Prophets, where you could show that at the end of every time prophecy, the Lord raises up a gathering prophet upon many witnesses. So when you get to 1844, you can show that Ellen White is a gathering prophet, and you can identify all the characteristics of a gathering prophet and show that it's a life or death message. So I determined I was going to take this guy through this study and lead him right into the time prophet so he could get under conviction about who Ellen White was right away. Okay, so we started doing that, and a couple times a week to try, because I thought he needed to get up to speed fast. And before long, there was, I don't know, probably roughly 20 people that were coming to our home on those 2 nights studying these things up at Hope International. And so that's all the staff of Hope International. They're not all, but it's the majority of the staff there. So they're getting ready for a camp meeting, and we've been going through this, and they're all wowed by this. I mean, and rightly so. When you start seeing that every reform movement's the characteristics of every reform movement plugs in with every other reform movement, and no one's ever seen these things before, they go to the leaders there at Hope International and say, hey, you need to allow Jeff to present this at this coming camp meeting. So this here are the notes that we presented in 1995. The first public presentation we ever did was this. It wasn't this, okay? And the first thing the Lord led us to understand was this. The second thing He led us to understand was this. When it goes public, it's this, and thereafter this. Okay, so that's the sequence of the development that I figured I'd put in place for you. And it wasn't anything about myself or Kathy pushing to do, you know, those first presentations. I got up there in front of all those people, and it wasn't hot. It never gets hot in Tacoma, but I was just soaked. I can remember that, just soaked. I was so scared I actually went out and got some hairspray because I didn't want my hair going all over. And I had some of the sisters that were friends coming up, don't use the hairspray anymore. You know, do you remember that, Kathy? It was totally not seeking to be a public speaker, okay? But that's a long time ago. Pardon me?
That really changed.
Yeah.
Yeah, you get used to doing it. Okay, so on number 8 there, the Lord does not repeat things that are no great consequence. The last sentence of number 8 from manuscript releases. The logic that was used there is, look at, you can see this. You can see these waymarks in the history of Noah. You can see these waymarks in the history of Moses, in the history of Elijah, in the history of John the Baptist, in the history of the Millerites. The Lord doesn't repeat things that are of no great consequence. It's kind of awkward how she says that, but what it's saying is the fact that you can see this repeated throughout the scriptures is putting an importance upon this reform line that we didn't understand at that point in time. We didn't understand it, but we were following on. Okay, then there's the emphasis of repeat of history. Page 3. The Bible has accumulated, this is from this previous quote, a carry-on from it. The Bible has accumulated and bound up together its treasures for this last generation. Right off the bat, we were understanding that we were the last generation. We didn't understand what that meant. We didn't understand that there's 4 symbolic generations of Adventism, and that at that sense we are the last generation of Adventism. We were understanding probably more that we're on the last generation of Earth's history. There's no way that we were seeing 4 generations in Adventism at that time. What I'm saying is that the Lord's already putting concepts in place that He's going to fine-tune as time progresses, but He's making sure that we're settled into that we're the last generation. Okay, well before we had prophetic arguments to prove that, other than just a thus saith the Lord. So you can see by the subtitle, by this is 1995 when this was presented. So before 1995, I've already reached a conclusion that the prophets present the same story. And what I'm saying to you is that the reason I reached that conclusion, although I don't remember all the details of my mental processes to come to that conclusion, is that when you bring these reform lines together at the end of the world and you see they're all telling the same story, then the logic is the prophets have to be telling the same story. And then you've got to say, well, what is the story? And the story is the last 6 verses of Daniel 11. And what I'm getting at here is in the 7th seal, the 7th seal has been typified by the 1st seal. The first thing that's opened up in this movement is going to have a repetition in the last thing that's opened up in this movement. Just like the first thing that was opened up in the Millerite history, the judgment hour message of William Miller is brought to perfection by the last thing that's opened up, which is the midnight cry message by Samuel Snow. So I'm arguing that the connection between the reform lines in Daniel 11:40 to 45 is the key to understand the first 39 verses of Daniel 11 correctly. You have those we have those lines. We're now at the point where we understand how to apply lines. We're the experts on applying lines. Now verses 1 through 39 is given to us, and for the first time as of December last year, we see that it's a series of prophetic lines, and the obvious point of reference is once again the last 6 verses of Daniel 11. This is a strong argument, if you're not following, to resolve some apparent discrepancies, such as, why are you saying Russia is the king of the south here and you're saying Russia is Syria over here? Okay, it's because this is a line and it has to be brought to this point of reference and judged by that point of reference. Okay, context, context, context. And this was what the Lord was doing at the beginning in His preparation for this history.
During our study with Brother Tyler, what we came to also understand is that the Hebrew mind always begins with the conclusion at the very beginning. And so when you look at a line, but if you try to make a circle, the beginning point of a circle is also the ending point of the circle. So the principle of Isaiah 46 said that the Lord demonstrated the end with the beginning. It's forcibly demonstrated in a circle or in a line. The beginning is the ending.
That's also called a what by the theologians? A chiasm. That's what a chiasm is. It's chiasm starts here, it steps up one, steps up one, steps up one, it gets to its high point, and then it steps down, and that last step is identical with the first step. The second step is identical with the step before the last step. It goes up and it comes down, but that's also your circle. But the theologians call it a chiasm. Yeah, and I agree with you, but I'm disagreeing with you. I agree with you, but I disagree with you. That what we call the Hebrew mind, that's God's mind.
Oh, amen.
And what we call the Greek mind, that's the mind of Satan.
Amen.
On page 3, after we put in place the significance of lines, then we start doing with waymarks. And this is where I have a problem. This is where for me, if you don't have to worry about me at all. But if you're wondering why I have such resistance to these foolish ideas that the effect of every vision is at midnight, it's from right here at the beginning. The great waymarks of truth. This is number 13 from Selected Messages, Book 2. And this passage where the Lord led us to begin this study was this passage. So the chapter that's Selected Messages, Book 2, page 101. Can you look that up? Type in the great waymarks of truth showing us our bearings in prophetic history. And it's going to take you to a chapter in Selected Messages, Book 2. And that chapter, I think it's called The Other Angel or something.
The 3 angels and the other angel?
The 3 angels and the other angel. Okay. For some reason, it's that chapter. I read that chapter and I thought, wow, this is really something we could study. So what I did is I went in and I typed that in. This is before computers. I used an actual typewriter with carbon paper. And I typed in that entire chapter, one paragraph at a time, and then at the end of one paragraph, I would write out a series of questions that came into my mind. And then that's what we studied in our study group for a long time. But you can tell right from the chapter title, the 3 angels and what? The other angel. It's in this chapter where we're going to see a 3-1 combination. Okay, it's going to start right there. The 3 angels and the other angel. And so many of the quotes that we're familiar with in this message, we sometimes don't realize they're from that chapter. If you go to that chapter and you read that chapter, you're going to find reference after reference that will be familiar to you. This is one of them. The great waymarks of truth showing us our bearings in prophetic history are to be carefully guarded. So right from the start of this, the Lord is saying, hey, these waymarks, why do you have to guard them? Because they're going to come under attack. Okay? And when do the prophets, prophetic application of the prophets get applied? At the end of the world. So at the very end, you're going to have the most serious warning about guarding the waymarks comes at the very end. Okay, so here we are at the very end, which I would say the end can be typified by the word omega. And sure enough, the waymarks are under attack, whether people want to see it or not. So nothing to do with me, but I want you to see that from the very beginning of all this, the chapter where we first began studying in 1989, it's emphasizing a warning about whatever the waymarks are, because at that point we're not even sure what the waymarks are when we first start studying, or what a waymark even is. But whatever it is and whatever they are, we're seeing that inspiration is saying they're going to come under attack and you have to guard them.
And the first paragraph, and you don't have it bolded, but right after this last generation, it says, all the great events and solemn transactions of Old Testament history have been and are repeating themselves in the church in these last days. And I think this is also a principle that goes along with what you're saying.
Yes.
And that gives us permission to do what we're doing with the line.
Now, here's my point on what you're saying, just because I want you all, for this to click on you, if it's necessary to click on you. Tons of passages in the spirit of prophecy where she's talking about food we're supposed to eat, where we're supposed to live, how we're supposed to deal with our children, how we're supposed to discipline in the church, so on and so forth. But the passages the Lord is opening up in 1989, they're pointing to this very period here at the end. He had thousands and thousands of paragraphs in the spirit of prophecy he could have led us to, but he didn't. And the ones he led us to are so spot on that if you think it was a human being that was doing this, and you're sadly mistaken. Okay, and so you're right. Yeah, as I was reading through this, I wanted to put this in place over a couple presentations, and as I read through it yesterday, I thought, I probably won't finish this before I have to leave for Europe anyway, but I'm going to do it anyway. My point is that almost every one of these quotes that I'm going over really quickly, if you take the time to read them, you're going to see that they're really significant to here and now. And that was 1989. So I agree with you. Yeah, there was more to that quote. Okay, a waymark is defined there. A mark to guide in traveling. Set thee up waymarks, make thee high heaps, set thine heart toward the highway, even the way which thou wentest. Turn again, O Virgin of Israel, turn again to thy cities. Bearing, okay, because in the quote from Selected Messages, it says, the great waymarks of truth showing us our bearings. So the word bearing means the situation of an object with respect to another object, by which it is supposed to have a connection with it or influences upon it, or to be influenced by it. Okay, so a waymark, what I'm understanding from this early on, is a waymark is not just a singular historical event that fulfilled prophecy. If you're going to understand it correctly, you need to understand the events that lead to the fulfillment of that prophecy and what it produces when it's fulfilled. What is the aftermath of its fulfillment? As an example, at 9/11, the everlasting gospel begins, and you're going to have a 3-step testing prophetic message that's going to develop and then demonstrate 2 classes of worshipers. But to see that, you want to know where it starts. Okay, so it starts when that angel comes down. So that's the waymark. 9/11 is a waymark. But the bearings that it projects on the next history up to midnight have to be understood correctly, or you're destroying the waymark. And that's exactly what's going on now in people that are still kind of trying to associate themselves with this movement, when in reality they've thrown the whole message of the movement out. Anyway. Okay, so now location. The Lord began to put an emphasis on the importance of locating the messages. The proclamation of the first, second, third angel's message have been located by the word of inspiration. Not a peg or a pin is to be removed. Okay, so that's pretty simple at its basic level. Did you have your hand up? No? Okay, so see, that's pretty simple, But I want to show you where it begins to be trouble. And it first came to surface at some meetings that we had in Georgia. And those meetings, you don't realize the purposeful, sometimes the purposeful attacks that have been launched against this ministry or against myself or whatever. But there was a time we were working closely with some ministries. One ministry was from Korea. And that brother, the Korean brother, he would take speakers from the United States over to Korea twice a year because he had support base in Korea. And his testimony to me is that I was the only person from the United States that he ever took there more than twice, okay, because he liked the message up to a certain point. And he took us to Korea 3 times. And, but there came a point where he lost his way. And then the brethren that had opened the door for us in South America, they lost their way too. But they came together, they were together. And we didn't know that they'd turned against the message. And there's a Latin pastor in Adventism that's a charlatan and a heretic. Okay, he's a charlatan and a heretic. He's into getting the dollar bills out of the Latin brethren's pockets, and he does it well. Okay, but he also is a futurist. And by that I mean he takes prophecies that have already been fulfilled, he places them at the end of the world and applies them in a literal fashion instead of a symbolic fashion. You know, you take the 1260-year prophecy, you bring it at the end of the world and said the papacy is going to rule that 1 hour is 1260 literal days, so on and so forth. And we were working in South America for a long time, so we were always running into his influence constantly, having to clean up after him because he was just producing confusion. Yeah, I know who he is. Do you want to hear his name?
No, I'm wondering if it's the same person I'm thinking of. It doesn't matter. I didn't know if you were struggling for his name.
Oh, no.
Okay.
His first name is Hugo.
Oh, Hugo.
Hugo, which is Hugo in Latin. Anyway, so I didn't know the Korean guy and the people in Latin America we've been working with had turned against the message. And they invited me to come to Georgia and do a presentation because this Latin pastor was going to be there, and they wanted me to straighten him out because I know how to show that futurism is out in left field. So they set me up. Pardon me?
They wanted to have a Spanish magazine.
Yeah, and they called all the Latin ministries into there. They had to get this futurism out of the mix so they could start, all the Latin self-supporting ministries could come together and produce a mutual Latin publication. That was the story they told me. But what it was is that they wanted me initially to do away with him, show that he was wrong, put him to rest, and then they were going to unexpectedly, they were going to straighten me out there publicly too. That was their attempt. And so my point is this, back to this point. I didn't know this was coming, but it did happen. And okay, so in verse 14 it says, not a peg or a pin is to be removed. So by the time we reached these meetings in Atlanta, we recently heard this Korean pastor has been laid to rest now. We used to go to his ministry in Georgia, and so he was an old friend until these meetings. There reached a point when we're here where we're doing these presentations. I'm the only one speaking in Atlanta, and it's for several days. And I have 25, 30 presentations. And so we've dealt with this Latin pastor. He stands up after he begins arguing with me in some of the presentations, and I'd give him a thus saith the Lord, and I'd just shut him down. So he gets up, this Latin pastor, at the end, and he says, I have meetings I got to go to this weekend, so I'm going to have to leave early. He's leaving with his tail between his legs. He says, but I want you to all know that I understand what Brother Jeff is saying, and that I will never teach these things ever again that I've been teaching, that they're wrong. He gave that public testimony. And then he went down to Atlanta that weekend, that Friday and Sabbath. He taught the very same thing. So, it lasted for like 2 seconds. But he did give that public testimony that, yes, I'm wrong, he's right. But his style of presentation, it produces an excitement. Sister White says so. It produces an emotional experience. And if you're going to get into people's pocketbooks, you want to do it emotionally. All right? So it's a good technique for him. But now they're ready to deal with me. Okay? So we're getting to the point to where this waymark here, the formalization of the message, we're showing that John the Baptist formalized the message in the time of Christ, and that William Miller formalized the message. And so they start challenging me. How come you're putting 1996 up here for the formalization of this message? Okay, so don't you think it's wrong that you're saying that? I'm saying, well, I didn't say anything other than the time the End magazine was published in 1996. And they pushed me so hard that I had to go back to this. Not a peg or a pin is to be removed. If this is a waymark established upon the testimony of 2 or 3, the formalization of the message, then for you to deny it, or me to deny it, is to deny the truth. Okay, we don't have the right to hold any peg or pin, and that's what you're dealing with. Everything about this construction, all the way down here to 1844, every one of these waymarks, every element of it, some of them seem more minor than others. They're a peg or a pin. They're not to be removed, and they're not to be denied. They have to be acknowledged. They're part of the divine mind. And so this here is where the parting of the way went. They forced me to acknowledge that I was involved with formalizing this message. And the brother that was doing it from the Latin world, I says, don't forget, my brother, that the same year that we published this in English, you published it in Spanish. So you're cutting your own throat. And of course, he's totally off in left field now. So the idea that every pagan pin is important, it has personally cost me to have to stand on that. But it is. Every pagan pin, so when you're coming to midnight, and the rule of first mention is that the first time a subject is mentioned in the Bible, every element is in that first mention. Mm-hmm. That the first midnight cry was at Passover in Egypt, and that Moses had told Pharaoh a couple times, this is going to happen. Therefore, when you're talking about midnight, there is going to be a prediction before midnight without a doubt. And these guys that have left the truth are saying anyone that's teaching that is being inspired by an angel from a fallen angel or something along that line.
First of all, in 1842, the Lord raised William Foy, a prophet that he was given 2 visions that deals with the judgment. So right there in that history, you have predictions, even after the 1840, talking about the judgment of God, of the dead and the living.
What's that mean? What's the point?
Prediction before midnight. You're going to have it. We're going to have it.
Okay, all right.
But also,
Yeah.
I want to point out the history that you're giving me.
You got about a minute and a half.
Yeah, I'm just pointing out that what you just quoted, the 1st to the 13th and the 14th, comes from John Bell, Section 1 and Section 2, which was the same history dealing with the same issue that you were dealing with, futurism. Sister White had to deal in her time with John Bell. So here we're seeing that same concept, that history is repeating itself over and over again.
Yeah, and John Bell, for me, John Bell becomes a really classic passage because for several years there is... You would not believe how many futurists there are in Adventism, and I seem to bump heads with all of them. There was a famous woman in Canada I took flack over. There was a Cuban pastor. There's this Mexican pastor I was referring to. Tons of futurists. And the testimony of John Bell is one of your points of references for showing how foolish that is. And there's a passage in it where she says, you'll acknowledge that these prophecies were fulfilled in the past and they have their place. But nevertheless, you put them off into the future. She has a statement about that. And that's what these guys are doing up until recently. They were acknowledging, 9/11, it was a fulfillment of prophecy, but the characteristics of 9/11, they're going to be perfectly fulfilled at midnight. In fact, the misguided argument I got in Wales from the leader of all this foolishness was that in the time of Christ, what prevented the Jews from accepting Christ, the great antitype, is that they were studying the types. And that's not true. The Jews weren't studying anything. Okay? But the reason that he manufactured this idea, this brother in Wales, is he is saying that what happened at 9/11 was a type, and the perfect fulfillment is the antitype, and that's at midnight. But now they've progressed even further. They're getting away from even acknowledging that 9/11 is a type. It's just, it kind of didn't. I don't know what they're saying, but this is John Bell all over again. Okay. Brother Nathan, you want to have a prayer?